Well, hello again, everybody, and welcome to Conversations with the Dean. I'm Turney Stevens. I'm the Dean of the College of Business at Lipscomb University, and I'm delighted today to welcome my friend, Mark Gill. Mark, welcome to the Lipscomb campus.
Thank you, Turney. It's good to be here.
Well, we're honored to have you. You and I have been friends a long, long time. In fact, you and I were partners and colleagues for many years, and so it is a particular honor to welcome you to the Lipscomb campus. And maybe we should just sort of begin with the name Rogers. You're the retired Chief Executive Officer of Rogers Capital Group. Mm-hmm. So who was Rogers?
Rogers was Joe M. Rogers, Ambassador Joe M. Rogers, prominent businessman, public policy advocate, ambassador to France under the Reagan administration, played in a lot of different fields in a lot of different ways, left a mark on Nashville and the world, was a phenomenal guy and a wonderful partner.
So he was the founder of the firm.
He was.
And you were his principal partner for many, many years.
29.
Tell us about how Joe came to be Joe. He started where and how did he end up as the United States ambassador to France? What a tremendous honor.
It was a remarkable trek, it really was. Joe was from South Alabama, from Bay Minette, and then actually spent most of his young life in Montgomery. Was co-captains with Bart Starr on the high school football team, went to University of Alabama, came to Nashville and started a small construction company with the McDowell family, McDowell Enterprises at that time, was going to do road signs and guardrails. They set up a joint company, a subsidiary, and they were going to delegate out the small projects they couldn't afford to do. And so he started off down that road doing that, got a few small contracts for some small office buildings. And as fate had it many times in Joe's life, he received a call from Ron Hogue at Third National Bank. Mr. Sam Fleming at that time invited annually people to go down to the Masters, had a house there. He was a member of the Masters, and they had someone drop out. And so Ron calls Joe at the last minute and said, "Would you like to go?" And Joe said, "Sure." And ended up staying in the same house with a doctor from Nashville who had just gotten started in for-profit health care. Mm-hmm. And he had helped co-found a company called Hospital Corporation of America, was Dr. Tommy Frist Sr. They hit it off that weekend, and at the end of the weekend, Dr. Frist said, "How'd you like to build me a hospital?" And Joe said, "Sure." Joe was always up to challenges. And I think he thought that he was talking about remodeling an operating room or something like that. I mean, for-profit hospitals were not around then. And so he did. But the first one was in Erin, Tennessee. He built the first 5 without a contract. And I think I'm remembering this number right. I think that the Rogers companies, which Joe sold in 1979, I think they built $1.8 billion worth of hospitals for HCA over the years.
A remarkable accomplishment and quite a remarkable level of trust that Hospital Corporation of America had in Joe Rogers and his company. Now, another founder of HCA was a very famous business person, also deceased now, Jack Massey, who had bought Kentucky Fried Chicken, made a lot of money when he sold it, and had bought a big house over in Belmead. Yes. And I remember a story that Joe told me, I'm sure you've heard the same story. I think he built Mr. Massey's driveway. And he was smart enough to say yes when opportunity knocked.
Yes.
And so Joe was quite an entrepreneur, wasn't he?
He was. Joe saw opportunities in America. It's part of what led him into politics, because he so loved this country. He felt like that the opportunities here for any individual were boundless. And that optimism allowed him to step out and try things that I wouldn't have tried. A lot of times he fell on his face, but more times than not he was successful. And not in the traditional B school kind of manner, and I don't mean that in a disrespectful standpoint, but Joe was more of an artist than a scientist. You learn the technical aspects of linear regression and time value of money, and that part is absolutely integral to being successful in business. But there's also the part of just being able to look and understand what the customer needs and where there's a hole in the marketplace. And Joe had that. A huge quality he had. And many, many times I came to him as an accountant, and we would have straightforward discussions, if you will, about potential investments. And early on, I was more constraining than I should have been, and didn't really respect the talent of him as an artist. He changed my mind pretty quick. I learned to listen.
Well, you know, I've often told people from my association with both you and Joe that Joe was the sort of guy who never met a deal he didn't like. And the truth of the matter was, Joe was very discerning about the business plans, but Joe never met a potentially successful person that he didn't like. And so he put a lot of emphasis in the people. And wouldn't you say that was the number one thing that he looked for when he looked at deals? Who's the person?
Yes, who brought him the transaction, and what their background was, and who he knew that they knew. And when you look at the Rogers companies and the people that were around Joe, a lot of successful people came out of it, all the way from, you know, Bob Anderson, who runs R.G. Anderson's company, successful, built that, owns majority of it. Jack Ferris, who ran NFIB and was one of the most influential people in politics in the nation. Ronald Reagan was one of those people. Back in 1976, when no one really thought Ronald Reagan had a chance, Joe was his statewide chairman in Tennessee. So yeah, Joe didn't look at the resume so much as he did the credibility that was established from the School of Hard Knocks. And you're right, he looked very hard at the people.
Mark, you brought up Ronald Reagan's name, and so maybe it would be appropriate to connect Joe's business career with what came later, which was a fabulously successful career in what I would call politics. He was never an elected official, but he was clearly involved in politics. And so how did he make that transition from being in business, building hospitals for HCA and for many other companies, to being a primary fundraiser for someone like Ronald Reagan, and then on to France to be the United States ambassador to France?
It's a good question, and one that has sort of multiple parts to answer it. He never set out to get into politics as someone, never wanted to run for office, never did run for office. But he had a button set on his desk that said, get into politics or get out of business. And the time frame that he got started in politics is very similar to the time frame today. You had very anti-business policies coming down through the government. And particularly the labor unions were very active. And to digress just a second, part of what convinced him he had to was the Opryland strike, where the union, at that time, construction in Nashville was about 90% union. And Opryland had signed a contract with Danny Thomas to open up live broadcast, and the union went on a wildcat strike. So they came to Joe and asked him if he would cross the picket line, and he did, and in 6 weeks he finished it, poured concrete for 72 straight hours.
This was the park.
This was the park, that's
when
correct.
When it was originally being built by the National Life and Accident Insurance Company, he stepped in and helped them to complete the park.
And completed it, and at considerable risk. He had to have detectives on his house. He had to have detectives to take his kids to school. It was rough and tumble kind of stuff. And that strike broke the union's back when Joe completed that. And they say today, I didn't remember seeing this, but Joe told me that if you went back and looked at the broadcast, you could still see wet paint behind Danny Thomas as he was doing the broadcast. It was that close to getting it completed. Today, construction unions in Nashville are almost non-existent. And there's a reason for that, because they were an impediment to productivity. So politically, he saw that business couldn't prosper, that the economy couldn't prosper, that opportunities for people from South Alabama that didn't have a Harvard education couldn't prosper if the economy wasn't growing. And I think that's what led him into politics. He signed on to Ronald Reagan because Reagan had the philosophies that he believed in, and that was what motivated him. Never got into it for the idea of I'll do something, high profile someday, or there's something in it for me. Reagan appointed him to ambassador to France in '85. He served 4 years and did a phenomenal service for the country.
Well, let's fill in a blank or two before we get to the experience that he had in France, because clearly that's very interesting. But even before that, he sold his construction business and I believe became the finance chairman for the Republican Party nationwide, I assume because of the relationships that he had developed, and then later became what, the finance chairman for Ronald Reagan in his reelection campaign?
He was the finance chair. He headed up the inaugural. I think he was finance chair for the election campaign. He was finance chair for the Republican National Committee, and that was back at a time when it was just a lot of work and it was fairly thankless. Today, it's very competitive to be that. So yes, Joe was one. If you go back to in 1980. There was a famous commercial of a Tip O'Neill lookalike driving down the road, and someone sitting in the car saying, "Senator, I think we're going to run out of gas." And the O'Neill character respond, "Oh, no, that can never happen." And then, of course, they run out of gas. And the point was, the country's headed in the wrong direction. Gas prices are going through the roof. Unemployment was outrageous. Interest rates were very scary. And that was the time frame. Joe actually was skipping over something very significantly. He sold the majority of his company in '76, and then had a massive heart attack at a fairly young age, at 46 years old, and had triple bypass surgery. Stepped down from the construction company, sold the balance of it in '79, and did go to Washington and work with the Republican National Committee. From there, Reagan understood that people are policy. So you send the people that have your philosophies overseas where you can't watch them and know what's going on, as opposed to trying to have some kind of major control over them. You know where they're coming from in their heart. And he knew where Joe was coming from his heart. And Joe did a fabulous job, was involved in some very important things, such as when the U.S. bombed Libya. Joe was the one who asked the French if the bombers from England can fly over France. And France said no. He was the one that they turned down. Strangely enough, because they thought that we need to hit Gaddafi harder. Don't just make him a little mad. I think they were wrong. I think what Reagan did changed those things. But it was involved a lot of things. I'll tell you an interesting story. At that time, there was a lot of terrorism going on in Paris, a lot of bombings, and primarily anti-Western precursor to Al-Qaeda, I suppose, but it was Islamic-based. And Joe said it never bothered him, even though he was definitely a target. It never bothered him until he was to go to speak at Normandy. Set date, everybody knew he was coming, well publicized, and he said that really didn't cross his mind much until a local hospital called up and wanted to know his blood type.
So that made him a little nervous.
See, that got his attention, yeah.
So let's go back to 1984, 1985, just for a moment. Ronald Reagan gets reelected. Joe's involved in raising funds for Ronald Reagan, chairs his inaugural committee. Ronald Reagan says to Joe Rogers, I would like to ask you to be a part of my administration, and offers him one of the 2 or 3 most prestigious diplomatic posts in the world. It's easy to underestimate the importance of being the U.S. ambassador to France, but the predecessors in that role included Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, and for centuries, really, at least 200 years, that has been the most prestigious post of the State Department. And so Joe Rogers, this young entrepreneur from Alabama, suddenly finds himself in one of the most prestigious positions in the world. That must have been really interesting. What did he think when he was offered that?
He never shied from a challenge. I think to some extent he was blessed with not recognizing just how important perhaps it was or how much of a challenge it would be, in part because I think he had always been able to rise to the occasion. But I'll never forget, I was in the office, where our offices were in Vanderbilt Plaza at that time, and my office was down the hall from his, and this was before he had accepted, and the administration had just offered him the post, and before he had accepted. And my secretary came in, I was on the phone, and she slipped me a note that said, Joe needs to see you right away. So I go into his office, and he's got a 3-ring binder laying on the desk, and he's flipping through it, and it is a binder about the residence and the embassy in Paris. Beautiful old Rothschild mansion that was the Luftwaffe's headquarters when they took Paris, when the Third Reich was there. So he starts asking me, starts showing me stuff. He says, look, honey's going to have 18 servants to take care of the house. And I'm going to have X number of Marines on my staff, and the CIA will be reporting to me. And then he gets to a page and he says, I'm going to have 8 footmen. And he pauses for a second, looks up and says, I had the cleanest shoes in France.
And he did.
And he did.
And he did. And even when he came back, he expected to have the cleanest shoes.
He did. But I think the point was that was the America that Joe Rogers knew and fought for.
Yeah.
A guy from South Alabama who then went to the State Department and took 6 months of French. And he said the only thing he knew to compare it to was open heart surgery. This was not someone who was groomed by the elite. This was someone who worked hard and was able to achieve the American dream that only America provides.
Yeah.
And yet he ends up being, as you say, in one of the highest positions in the world, and did a great job. Ended up getting the Legion of France award, which is the highest civilian award that's allowed to be in France, to be given to a non-French citizen. And there have been very few Americans that ever received it. I think Thomas Jefferson did, but there have been very few, all of that caliber. And it was because he worked so hard and went there to serve his country and did.
And achieved unbelievable success in the eyes of the French people.
In the eyes of the French people, absolutely.
And
yes.
here was this young guy from Alabama, or at least he started out as a very young guy from Alabama, and he rose to these unbelievable heights. Joe became a Christian along the way, and he had a great faith in God. And I think if he were sitting here today, of course he passed away a few years ago, unfortunately, due to lung cancer. But if he were sitting here today, I think he would say that he was providentially called in his career. Do you feel he felt that?
Yeah. Yes, I do. And I think if you didn't have to be around him very long to feel that as well. Not that he wore his religion on his sleeves, but he didn't shy away from it. Joe was a contractor. Contractors are not noted for the industries. It's a rough and tumble industry. He was saved at a Billy Graham crusade in Knoxville, and prior to that had gone to church, had been a leader in the church and whatnot, but didn't know Christ, and shared with that. And then of course, after his heart attack, of course, the heart attack played an interesting role in his life and an interesting role to watch from a spiritual development. Joe got up every morning from 1946 until he died at age 75, thinking, I may die today. His heart was sufficiently damaged in his heart attack. And his family had heart disease, and he had an older brother who had died at about that age of heart disease. As he said, that was a short leash. And then to compound that, in 1984, he had a heart attack in 76. In 84, he developed diabetes. Those two are lethal. The combination of those are lethal. And so he got up every day thinking that this may be his last. And that kept him seeing all these great things that he accomplished, and the wealth and the prestige and the places that he had been and seen. It helped give him more of a spiritual perspective of what life was all about, and kept him grounded, I think.
Became quite a giver. He was a very generous, philanthropic person. I can remember many nights his assistant handing him a folder of letters and requests that had come in the later years from all over the world. And he would go home at night, and of course this was before the days of laptops and iPads. He would dictate responses to each of those letters. People from Nigeria saying, will you send me 100 Bibles? And he would make provision so that would happen, and he would dictate a letter back and say, God bless you. Very generous person.
Extremely. One of the things that I have come to, I guess, conclude from life is that the closer you get, there's an old saying that the last person to recognize greatness in a man is his valet. The closer you get to a person, you see their imperfections, and all of them have imperfections. Joe had tremendous strengths, but he also had great weaknesses. But he is the only person that I've ever gotten, as I got closer, he became a bigger person. Joe was a bigger person as an individual than his public persona was. Joe got up every day, unlike anybody that I've ever known, and attacked what it was in his life that God showed him needed to be addressed. It didn't matter whether it was orphans in Russia, whether it was his temper, whether it was children being killed in their womb in the United States, whether it was his temptation for greed, whatever it was that God showed him, without reservation, he attacked it. Didn't always win, but he always fought. And it produced great results. We've seen him bringing the Billy Graham crusade here and all those things he's involved with. What most of the public hadn't seen are the things like the young man. Joe was very high profile in his opposition to abortion, even going to the point where he and Tom Cummins withdrew their support from the United Way here because they funded Planned Parenthood. And 82, 83, sometime along that line, this young man comes to the office, wants an appointment with him one day. And Joe sees him, he's in his 20s, early 20s. And the kid goes in and says, all right, look, in theory, you say you oppose abortion. My girlfriend's pregnant, and I'm going to have to quit school, and we'll never be able to have good jobs. I won't be able to support the kid, all that other kind of stuff. And yet you sit here and say that, without having to face those kind of consequences, that abortion's wrong. And Joe said, I tell you what, I'll loan you the money to stay in school. You have that child. And Joe wrote him a check, and the kid left. Married the girl. Some 2 years later came back and paid the loan back and said, this is a picture of my son. Thank you, he's the greatest blessing on earth.
Amazing story.
There are lots of those.
I'm sure there are. But this interview is with Mark Gill, not with Joe Rogers, and you played a very important role yourself. In fact, probably very humbly and greatly underestimated by most people. Joe got a lot of honor and glory and a lot of publicity, but you were there every day. I'll even say the power behind the throne. So tell me, Mark, how did you meet Joe, and how did you become his principal partner in all of his business affairs?
I started my career at Arthur Anderson & Company. I grew up in Appalachia, small family farm. Went to work for Arthur Anderson & Company, was in my 5th year there. Rogers Construction was one of their clients. It was not one of my clients. I had never met Joe, but I knew who he was. Knew he was a strong Christian, and knew he was a successful businessman. And a headhunter called me and said that he was looking for sort of a private chief financial officer. And I wanted to meet him. I was very happy with what I was doing with Anderson. And so I wanted to meet him. So I said, I'll go interview with him, even though I'm not necessarily interested in the position. We went and had lunch. He offered me a job. Went to Italy for a couple of weeks, a vacation. Then we got back, he called me and went back to have lunch. Had a good conversation during the lunch. Walked back to his office building, standing on the steps, going up, and he says, well, how about my offer? And I said, Mr. Rogers, I really appreciate it, but I'm in a really good place right now, and I just can't afford to do that. And in a typical of his aggressive style, he immediately says, well, how much would it take? And it, put me back, and I had not thought about it. But here was one of the most powerful men and successful men in Nashville asking me a question, so I threw out a number. He shook my hand and turned around and walked upstairs. I went back to the office, and on the way back to Anderson, I was thinking, I've just accepted a job, or he thinks I've accepted a job. This is one of the biggest clients at Anderson, one of the most powerful people in Nashville. I hadn't even thought about this. So I went home, my wife and I prayed a lot about it, decided it's what we should do. And one of the great blessings of my life.
And clearly it was providential, both
was.
for Joe and for you, because it was really Mark Gill who made it possible for Joe to be able to go to France and be an ambassador for 4 years, and still his business affairs were taken care of very effectively here because of your faithfulness to him.
Our personalities, our views, both politically, spiritually, fit well. I had huge admiration for him. I think he respected me. We fought all the time, and that was part of the strength of our relationship. We were we could say anything to each other. We didn't have agendas. We didn't keep secrets, and we didn't walk on eggshells around each other. If he saw me doing something wrong, he'd say it.
And you would say it to him.
And I would say it to him.
You
and
had
he
that
would hear
kind
it.
of relationship.
And one of the things that I came to appreciate about him is that he would fight hard for his position. And if I didn't fight hard for mine, then he would assume that I really didn't believe it. But if I was really insistent about it, and on more than one occasion I said to him, well, you can go ahead and do it, but I'm not going to participate in this deal. I don't think on any one of those did he do it. And it wasn't so much, he was just looking for my conviction. Was I really convicted about this, or was this just my opinion? So having that open relationship of being able to, to say what you think and to be honest and open and not worrying about hurting someone's feelings, that was really beneficial for both of us. 29 years. He had several key people close to him. The longest serving of anyone else, I think, was 8. And it was a bit of a pressure cooker. I mean, Joe was high energy, always doing lots of interesting things, generally pushing into an area that was new and entrepreneurial, which meant that it wasn't something we knew what we were doing. We were striking out new ground, like going to Hungary after the Berlin Wall fell, as you were a big part of. But it was indeed one of the greatest blessings of my life.
Mark, I've told people over the years that I felt like my association with you and with Joe Rogers qualified me as the Noah of investment banking, and people would look at me like I had lost my mind and say, well, what in the world does that mean? And I would say, well, I've done 2 of every kind of deal.
Yes, absolutely.
Because Joe never had any strategy that I knew of. It was who walked in the door with the next great idea, and again, who he trusted, who the person was.
Very opportunistic. I used to say our portfolio looked like Noah's Ark. We had 2 of everything.
2 of everything.
Yeah, it was that. But that always kept it fun and exciting, as you'll recall, because we were always moving in at cellular telephone.
Sure.
No one knew anything about cellular telephone, and we did a cellular telephone deal. I still own stock from the days of the cellular telephone. I still have my same phone number. When we sold to McCall, part of the deal was they gave me a number that I liked. So always doing fun stuff, unique stuff, and the flip side of that is that you fail a fair share of the time. You do stuff that in retrospect people look at it and say that looks really stupid, but it was those kind of things, those long balls that also were very rewarding.
And it was really an exciting time. When he came back from France, he brought with him a Rolodex that contained presidents and kings and rulers and CEOs from all over the world. But the interesting thing about it, on his calendar might be a phone call with the president followed by a meeting with some unknown young person who has an idea.
Yes.
And Joe treated those 2 exactly equally and gave both of them his full attention, which I always admired, and I learned a lot from that lesson.
He loved business. He loved the excitement of the deal. He really did. It was a passion for him.
So you did very well.
I've been fortunate.
You've been able to participate in a lot of successful ventures, maybe a few that were more educational than successful.
Yes.
I suspect we can all count a few of those. But now you're at least semi-retired, and so what are you doing these days?
I have 4 children scattered around the world. They take a fair share amount of time. I'm very proud of them. I have always been involved in civic and political things. Joe's did more things on the national level. For the last 25 years, I've been involved at the state level, working with business organizations on policy, and then from an election standpoint, trying to help elect good legislatures. And that's been fun. That's been gratifying. Tennessee is a wonderful place. I don't think most Tennesseans have any idea how fortunate we are. I think that for most of my life, Tennessee may have been the most free market jurisdiction, the second most in the world. Hong Kong, I think, is first. But certainly of the 50 states, even more so than Texas, which is a great place to do business, I think Tennessee has been, and I hope will continue to be, more free market than any other states in the country.
In the last few years, you've been very passionate about your interest in tort reform. And I suspect most people who have been in business have found themselves caught up in perhaps what's wrong with our legal system, which allows anybody to sue anybody, anytime, for anything without recourse. And so tell us about tort reform. You were successful in getting a piece of legislation passed in last year's General Assembly, which reformed the tort laws in Tennessee. What did that do, and what's your vision for where that goes from here?
Well, first let me broaden that. There were lots of people very instrumental in it. It's a monumental task and would be like fighting World War II, so it would be very hard for anybody to claim very much credit for it. The tort system in the United States is very important. I think that people see it as, you either want to stop all the lawsuits or which is what business gets accused of, or you want to be able to sue for anything, which is what the trial lawyers get accused of. In its purest sense, it is a free market regulatory process, meaning that the way that in our country that we keep crooks off the street or shysters or charlatans, we have some regulation, but originally it was the ability to go to court and put these people before their peers and to be compensated back for it. And when you think about it, there's only two ways to hold bad people accountable in our society. One of them is to pass laws, which I think we all have found is fairly ineffective. And the other is to go to the civil justice system.
So you have the criminal system and the civil system.
That's correct. The civil system has gotten broken down. In the 1960s, there was a much more of it's your responsibility to take care of yourself, and someone else is not always at fault, and just because something bad happens to you doesn't mean it's always somebody else's fault. That got changed, and the progression of the Consumer Protection Act in Tennessee is an excellent example. It was originally passed in the 60s. It was very limited, only a couple of things. And then every so many sessions, they would expand it. So today it's a list this long, and the last one that they passed was a catch-all that meant you could just about sue anybody for anything. For example, one of the latest gold mines that was developing here was to be able to sue under securities fraud, and securities, as you know, are governed by both the federal government, from various agencies, and the state government through the Department of Commerce, and so that's a very heavily regulated area. And so if there was an attorney who wanted to bring a case under those statutes and it didn't fit, then he would just go over and do this catch-all of consumer protection. And of course, securities aren't a consumer product. And so it's that kind of things. We changed the catch-all provision. It's now gone. So you have to sue specifically under what's been provided under the statutes. That's a big change. Part of tort reform that was passed is the regulatory compliance portion. If you are a business and you comply with the regulations, then you shouldn't be subject to punitive damages. Punitive damages are people who intentionally do things wrong. If you're trying to comply and do comply with the regulations, you're not intentionally doing anything wrong. So we've exempted them from punitive damages. We also had a situation in the state of Tennessee where for years we are not a judicial hellhole like Texas or Mississippi had become, but it's been because we had a good conservative judiciary. Those people are now retired, and we now have more activist judges involved, and especially at our Supreme Court, where we have a serious problem in the state right now with 4 of the 5 Supreme Court justices being very anti-free market. And so we started attracting lawyers that were coming out of Texas, no longer able to sue there, or out of Florida, and some very high-profile cases here from people out of state coming in and getting some huge judgments, mostly punitive damages. This piece of legislation puts a cap on punitive damages of $500,000 or twice compensatory, and it puts a cap on non-compensatory damages, which are pain and suffering, emotional distress, those kind of things. It puts a cap of $750,000 on that. It puts no cap, and this is what some real misinformation has been put out. If you can't work and if you have medical bills, there's no cap on that. If you've have been burned in a car accident and for the rest of your life, or your child is going to need medical care, there's no cap on those recovery, and that's fair. If someone has injured you, then you need to be able to recover for it. So, great piece of legislation. Some things that still need to be done. We're going to go back this session, I think, and try and do some more. For example, we need to improve the trespasser liability law on a national basis. That has been expanded, where property owners are liable for people trespassing. They've expanded the rights of trespassers. We need to stop that. And there are several provisions like that tend to be more tweaks, but still very important for our state and our justice system work. One that we would like to see passed is that for a suit that is dismissed in summary judgment, for the loser to have to pay. I mean, if it's so egregious that the judge dismisses it or rules without it even going to trial, then somebody obviously brought a suit that, someone was being unreasonable, and the unreasonable person ought to bear the cost for that.
And
suit.
the system now is that there's no recourse.
None.
You can sue anybody, anytime for
That's
anything, and if it sticks, it sticks. If it doesn't, it doesn't. But the person who is being sued has to pay their expenses to defend themselves and prove that. And sometimes what happens, not to disparage members of the legal profession, because there are many honorable members of the legal profession, but sometimes lawyers know that in order to move on, a business will simply settle for less than it would cost to go to court, or maybe go through the discovery process. And so that's a $50,000 settlement, and a lawyer can make a pretty good living, some do, off of taking a third of that, or 25%. So if you were able to pass the legislation that you're referring to, that would help to cap that and stop that.
It would help unclog our system. It would, I think, make it a system that would help reward. I mean, this works two ways. If an insurance company is just being difficult and they're going to take you to court and drag out your payment for 2 years, if they have the threat of losing in summary judgment and having to pay your legal expenses, they're going to be more reasonable. The ambulance chaser components are going to be less likely if they have that risk. It just makes it more beneficial for the injured party, and I think increases the chances for the injured party to get recovered without making it trying to hit the lottery through things.
Sure.
So we think that that's going to have significant implications on a going forward basis in this state, and I think it's something that was overwhelmingly supported by the populace, and we were getting well over 2/3 of the votes of both houses of the legislature, and so something that I think's good and needs to move forward. We would also, I think Tennessee, if I can just take a second to talk about Tennessee. Tennessee's very fortunate. We have people here who have benefited us, our generation, and our grandchildren that nobody even knows their name. People like Senator Tommy Burks, Senator Doug Henry. Tommy Burks is dead. Senator John Wilder, Lieutenant Governor John Wilder, phenomenal job of doing what was right for the state. There was a group of about 8 to 10 senators who, during the progressive era, when many states were chasing progressive policies, these people stood firm and said, no, we're not going to expand government, we're not going to encroach upon the freedoms of our individuals, and we're not going to put burdens on people out there trying to make a living that will cause our state to be poor. And a long history of that. Ned McWhirter was one of those as well. Most of them Democrats, quite frankly. Ben Ashley was a Republican, but those people stood firm, and because of that, we've had phenomenal growth in this state for the last 40 years. Exceeded the national average, according to Dr. J.R. Clark's analysis, by 25%. We owe those people a debt of gratitude, and it's unfortunate that most Tennesseans don't even know it happened.
Sure. Well, Mark, we're almost out of time, and I wish we weren't, because we could talk a lot longer. Let me conclude our interview with the question that you and Joe taught me to ask in due diligence. So the last question, was always supposed to be, what did I not ask you that I wish I had known to ask you? So you've had an amazing journey. You said that you'd started in the upper Cumberland area of Appalachia. You were an accountant, and then you were partners with Joe Rogers. Now you've been involved in tort reform. You've done many, many things and had opportunities that most of us don't have the opportunity to have. What last thing do you wish I'd ask you about?
Let me start off that answer by saying that the best accountants that I worked with came from Lipscomb.
Thanks.
Broader conclusion there. I grew up in the Upper Cumberland. One of the brightest men I have ever known had a second-grade education. Some of the least competent people I know have Hickey Freeman suits and Harvard degrees. It's about who produces. That's the only thing in business you should look at. Not activity, but productivity. Look at the institutions that produce. And I think one of the reasons that I'm here and one of the reasons I'm so excited about what you're doing is because I think Lipscomb is one of those institutions. But in business, look at the people who produce. Don't be clouded. And that's one of the things Anderson taught me. When you went to work for Arthur Anderson, you took your degree and you threw it in the trash when you entered the door, and they looked at who could produce. And that allows the Joe Rogers from South Alabama, or you know, the kid that played tennis at Lipscomb, that allows those people to grow and achieve. And when they achieve, the company achieves, and when the companies achieve, the country achieves. I think that that's what's best about our system, and I think it is one of the most important things, and unfortunately, I think it's one of the least recognized.
God promises us in His Word that He can do more, that He will do more than we can ask or imagine. And certainly your life has been testimony to that. Joe Rogers' life was testimony to that. And in many ways, I have you and Joe to thank for a little bit of that in my life too. And so thank you for the friendship and the relationship.
It is very mutual. Thank you.
Well, thank you. So my friend today has been Mark Gill. He's been our guest on Conversations with the Dean. Mark is the retired CEO of Rogers Capital Group, and we're honored to have had him here on the Lipscomb campus today. Please join us again soon for more episodes of Conversations with the Dean.